Hello, and welcome to Crucial Conversations on Cognitive Diversity, brought to you by Bridges 2E Media and the 2E Centre for Research and Professional Development. My name is Maria Kennedy, and along with John Baum and Stephanie Coxon, I will be curating your questions so they can be answered by our host, Scott Barry-Kaufman, and his guest, Dr. Geraldine Dawson. So when you logged in today, you were invited to answer a few questions in our welcome poll. So let's have a look at the answers. Okay, here we go. So, all right, so thank you all so much for responding. So we have quite a lot of people who do have children who have an autism diagnosis. And so it's 46% to 54%. And most of you whose students do have an autism diagnosis didn't get the diagnosis until they were older than 5. So 5 to 7, 8 to 11, and actually 12 or older seems to be the most popular time. Okie dokie. All right, so, whoops. So before we get going, before I introduce you to the host, I'd like to share a few housekeeping tips. So we now have 2 ways that you can communicate. The chat is for you to share your thoughts and your comments about what is being discussed. So please feel free to share and comment. There is also a Q&A tab at the bottom where you can write your questions for Scott Barry-Kaufman and Dr. Dawson. So some of your questions will be answered in the chat or directly back in the Q&A, and some will be answered live by Scott or Dr. Dawson. So you can write your questions at any time. Remember, the sooner you submit them, the more likely we will have time to answer them. There is also a live transcription. So if you would like to use it, if you click the CC button at the bottom of your screen, it will type and you will see everything that is being said. And on the up arrow, you can adjust the settings if you want to make this font larger. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed host. Scott Barry-Kaufman is a humanistic psychologist exploring the depths of human potential. Dr. Kaufman received a PhD in cognitive science from Yale University and has taught at Columbia, NYU, the University of Pennsylvania, and elsewhere. He hosts the Psychology Podcast, which is the #1 psychology podcast in the world. And he is author and/or editor of 9 books, including Transcend, The New Science of Self-Actualization, Wired to Create, Unraveling the Mysteries of the Creative Mind with Caroline Gregory, and Ungifted, Intelligence Redefined. In 2015, Business Insider named him one of 50 groundbreaking scientists who are changing the way we see the world. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce you to our host and my very dear friend, Dr. Scott Barry-Kaufman.
Oh, Maria, that was lovely. Thank you for such a kind intro.
You're awesome, Scott. You know this.
So are you, Maria. I really appreciate it. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce today Dr. Geraldine Dawson, who I will pause until we get her video on so you can see her. There we go. Dr. Dawson, welcome. Dr. Dawson is the William Cleland Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Duke University, where she is also Professor of Pediatrics and Psychology and Neuroscience. She is also the director of the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences and the Duke Center for Autism and Brain Development. Dr. Dawson's research focuses on early autism detection, treatment, and brain function. Dr. Dawson, thanks so much for being here on the season 2 finale. I don't know if we're allowed to mention that yet, but this is the season 2 finale of the Crucial Conversations on Cognitive Diversity series.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. Well, now, how did you get interested in this topic, Dr. Dawson?
Well, my interest started a long time ago. In fact, when I first started out in the field, autism was considered, a rare condition. And so things have changed so much over the last several decades. But when I was a teenager, our neighbors who lived across the street had twin boys with autism. They were 6 years of age. And in those days, there weren't, for the father, there wasn't the treatment available that he needed in the town that they lived in, and he had to travel far away. And so they asked me to come and take care of these two autistic boys. And so I would spend my weekends with them, and I learned so much about autism just by hanging out with them and learning about the things that they liked. I would bring them over to our house. We would play pool together. And that was my first, experience with autism. And then later on, when I was getting trained as a clinical psychologist in graduate school, my very first case that was given to me was a little autistic boy. And again, I enjoyed so much spending time with him. But at that point, we had really nothing to offer in terms of helping him to learn to communicate or to make suggestions to parents about how to help him thrive. And I really felt that, by devoting my career to this, that maybe I could make a difference. And so then and there I did, and I've never looked back. It's been over 30 years.
Well, you definitely have made a difference in multiple ways. The polls showed that the majority, their children didn't get identified till at least 5 years of age, with a lot over 12. Did those poll results surprise you at all?
Well, yes and no. The average age of diagnosis of autism in the United States is about 4.5. And so in that sense, that it's not surprising, right? And there's lots of reasons why we end up missing kids early on. Just to talk about one of those reasons, right now we have a very large grant from the National Institutes of Health to understand how when you have autism and also the person has something else, in this case, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which about 50% of autistic people also have ADHD, that makes early diagnosis much more difficult. So you're about 30 times more likely to get your diagnosis after age 6. So that's just one reason. There's lots of other reasons. For example, being a girl. We're learning that girls have a different way of expressing autism. And most of our diagnostic systems were developed for boys. So I think girls are often missed, but those are just a couple of reasons. So no, it's not surprising. It's unfortunate though, because I think those early years can be really helpful in terms of, making sure that the classroom environment and everything around that child is conducive to their development.
I completely agree. There seems to be a bit of a paradox that I hope you can resolve for me. Autism is usually characterized by a number of things, but one thing is detail-oriented focus and repetition. Yet ADHD seems to me to be characterized by diffuse attention. Can you explain to me how 60% have that comorbidity of what seems to me like paradoxical traits?
Right. Yeah, that is a really good question. So one of the things you notice, one of the things you notice in both cases, you're talking about differences in the way you pay attention to the world, right? So you said in autism, often the person might have, a special interest, paying attention to a detail, maybe an unusual detail that someone else might not notice. Whereas with when we think about ADHD, we think about distractibility. So you could still imagine a child who, for example, in a room full of lots of different toys might end up deciding they're interested in only this toy and really want to stick with that toy. At the same time, when they were asked to maybe do a task or something, got very distracted and weren't able to really complete that task because they were prone to distraction. So it is kind of an interesting combination of both having very specific interests that would draw your attention to certain things in the environment, but at the same time, specifically when task demands are made, right? So you need to complete this assignment, you need to follow these instructions. That's where you would tend to see the distractibility. And so I think that is the kind of combination that you see. And I will say that, until 2013, you couldn't even diagnose both autism and ADHD at the same time. So if the child had autism, you weren't allowed, so to speak, with the diagnostic tools that we had available to also diagnose ADHD. So it's very recent, if you think about, okay, it's only been, 7 years or so that we've actually been conducting research on this. But the other piece of ADHD is hyperactivity, right? And so that's a lot of motor activity, don't want to sit in your seat, always moving, fidgeting. So again, you could imagine a child or an adult, right, who has, specific interests, would hone in on specific details, but at the same time, be very active and have trouble, sitting and staying in their seat and so forth.
Thank you so much for that clarification. Yeah, I think it pretty much describes me to a T.
Well, and I think one of the reasons, so as you think about this, one of the reasons why kids who have both autism and ADHD are missed is because it is kind of a complex set of different characteristics, and trying to sort all those through can be complicated. You have to have a pretty careful diagnostician, so to speak, to be able to sort it all through and to understand, is this really two things going on? The other thing is that when you think about characteristics such as high activity levels or a distractibility, failing to follow through with instructions, those can be for a lot of other reasons besides ADHD. So in making that second diagnosis, you have to rule out a lot of things. So maybe that person is really active because they're really excited, right? And it really isn't hyperactivity, but it's an expression of excitement. So you can see why there's often a lot of confusion in making these diagnoses, and even why you could go to one person, get one diagnosis, and maybe go to another person, get a different picture. These are judgments, right, that psychologists and psychiatrists make. And so, there's a bit of a, not just a science, but a bit of an art to it.
Yeah, we have a tendency in psychiatry sometimes, and even in educational diagnoses, to essentialize these things as though, we do that with giftedness too, right? Like this person has the essence of giftedness, and then this person with 130 IQ has the essence of giftedness, and this person with a 129 IQ doesn't. And that's ridiculous.
Yeah, that is ridiculous.
These are not essences of a human. They're traits, they're characteristics, they're tendencies, proclivities, ways of seeing the world. They're not essences.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, we often lose sight of that. I think this is a good sort of quick question, even though we're not the Q&A part technically. Susan Topper wrote, could you comment on the overdiagnosis of autism? I've seen kids given diagnosis at a young age 3 or so, when they only have a language disorder. When the language normalizes, the social issues gradually resolve. I'm not a mental health professional, by the way. That's okay, Susan. You're a mental health, thoughtful human.
Yeah, so Well, first of all, I think one thing to keep in mind is that diagnoses can change over time. And so sometimes we think, and this kind of gets back to what you just said, Scott, about this idea of essence, right? These are just characteristics, and those characteristics can change over time. So about 10% of people who get a diagnosis with autism early in their life actually don't have that diagnosis later. And so it can change. So that I think could be one thing that's going on. But I think the other point that you're bringing up is that it's really important to understand that if a child, well, if they're having difficulties with social interaction, that could be for lots of different reasons. And that's one of the things that a good psychologist or psychiatrist will sort out. So as you're pointing out, that a child with a language disability might also have difficulties with social interaction, but it's not because of autism. It really is because, so many of the ways that we interact, particularly with kids, might be conversation. And this child, if they're delayed in their language acquisition, they might feel reticent, right, about trying to join in when they hear the kids talking, not knowing what to say. And that as those language problems, resolve, or the child just gets better at language, then the social difficulties start to lessen. So in that case, the social difficulties weren't really autism, they were language. Similarly, another reason why people would have trouble with social interaction is because they're anxious. So many times a child will be socially anxious, right? They may be shy or nervous or feel less confident in their interactions with other people. And it's the anxiety that's getting in the way, and it's not really autism. And so these are the things that when a child or an adult comes to our clinic, for example, I try to keep a very open mind and just listen to what is going on with this person, and then to entertain all the different possibilities of what might be explaining. And then only after you've kind of ruled out things like language difficulties, social anxiety, and other things, that you end up, deciding that this could be autism. So I think it's a really good point that you make, that it's possible to describe someone as being autistic when in fact maybe they aren't, and that we have to be really thoughtful about how we make a diagnosis.
Along those lines, you've done a lot of work on the most predictive early life characteristics of adulthood or lifelong autism. Can you tell people a little bit about your research you conducted, and what are some of the most central factors and even brain event related potentials that might be most predictive?
Yeah. So one thing, so talking about early symptoms of autism, one of the earliest symptoms is just paying attention to the world in a very different way. So, usually our brains are wired to be naturally interested in social interaction and drawn to paying attention to people. And with autism, what we find is that about 6 to 12 months of age, that baby is not showing as much attention to people. Some people have speculated that it might be a lack of interest in other people. Others have said maybe it's that the interaction is overstimulating, and we've never really been able to sort that out. But for whatever reason, that natural tendency to pay attention to people is usually lessening between 6 and 12 months of age. So, and then there are some other characteristics too. One of them is that around that period of time, kids start to develop gestures. And in particular, they use their gestures to share information with other people. So one of the classic things that develops by about 12 months of age is pointing. And if you've been around a 1-year-old, a neurotypical 1-year-old, they're doing a lot of pointing at things. They want to show you things. They want to share what they're seeing in the world. Look at mommy, look at. And that's also autism, early autism symptom is that lack of pointing. And in fact, this child might be overly focused, as you mentioned, on special interests, might want to spend their time playing with, toys that they're interested in, not necessarily wanting to bring other people into that play. And then another characteristic is imitation. So that's another thing that we typically do very naturally. We have a tendency to want to imitate other people. And even when we're talking with other people, we tend to match our movements. And if someone smiles, we smile. Even the movement of your head right now, Scott, is probably rhythmically in tune in some way with the movements that I'm making.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so we have this tendency to want to match our movements and to other people. And there are parts of our brain called mirror neurons that are really set up to be constantly mapping our own body movements onto the body movements of other people. And this starts very early, but by the time that a child is, say, 8 to 12 months of age, you see a lot of imitation. If you clap in front of a baby, they're going to tend to clap too. And if you smile, they'll smile. So that also tends to be not as robust or sometimes even missing. And then finally, in terms of babbling that starts to come in at that time, you don't see as much babbling. So all these things are happening where the baby is not engaging with the social world. And one of the things that happens is that the parts of our brain that are responsible for processing social information and making sense of the social world, and also the parts of our brain that are responsible for language, are developing at that period of time. And that baby's not really getting the input into those areas of the brain because they're not engaging with the social world. So one of the things that we believe is that autism is partly has to do with how that baby and child interacted with the world and how that stimulates different parts of the brain in a different way than a child who's engaged with the social world. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that it may actually help to explain some giftedness. Because so imagine that you have a brain up here and there's a certain amount of matter. And what happens is that matter is getting specialized and developed. And as you develop skills, different parts of the brain then are devoted right to those skills. So let's imagine then if you're spending a lot of time investigating the non-social world, you actually are probably becoming pretty expert in that. You're paying attention maybe to music, or you're paying attention to light, or the patterns that you see. You might be paying attention to art. And so, and you're not having to devote that same part of the brain to social interaction and language. So it's an interesting thing to think about how giftedness can develop, partly because this child is engaging so much in these other activities. So, one of the things when I think about therapy is how can we both help the child to learn social skills and learn how to communicate, because obviously that will help that person be successful, but not necessarily give up some of the specialness and some of the interests and giftedness that might come from these other interests, and so we want to sort of balance that and make sure that we don't ignore those things, right? So anyway, those are some of the early symptoms. But then what happens, we believe, is that areas of the brain that are specialized for processing social information, like making senses out of faces or facial expressions, are not getting that stimulation. And therefore, when we assess those, and we can do that with different techniques such as EEG, we find that they're just not as responsive. Now, interestingly, if we test the parts of the brain that are responsible for making sense of objects, those parts are absolutely fine, right? In fact, they may even be better than a neurotypical individual. But if we look at something like the fusiform gyrus, which is the face processing area, or the superior temporal sulcus, which is responsible for interpreting facial expressions, those areas are less active and less efficient in how they're working.
Yeah, having autism can be really difficult in the social world, and people, neurotypical people, take for granted lots of things and don't understand how exhausting it can be to go through just 3 social interactions during the course of a day. Like even like with like the UPS person, like can leave the person drained the rest of the day because you don't know, did I say something wrong? Did I comment? Was I not supposed to comment on how their hair looks stupid today? Like things like that. It could, because of the social rules, and it can be exhausting. I think we need to have a lot of compassion for people who brains are wired differently. You could imagine a world in which everyone else would look stupid if suddenly we didn't care so much about social niceties and we cared more about 3D mental rotation, or like we lived in a world where we really needed people to fix light bulbs and do problem solving and have higher level abstract reasoning on a more regular basis, then the rest of us would look stupid on a regular basis. So I think it's just really important to keep that in mind.
Yeah. No, I agree. In fact, there was a recent article published, and I'm sorry I don't remember the author, but the title of the article, I think, was something like the double empathy problem, right? And I think the idea there was that, we often say, oh, this autistic person that can't empathize, right? Because they can't really understand the emotions of the other person. But the article was very interesting in flipping it on its head and saying, yes, but what about the neurotypical person? How much are we able to empathize, right, with the autistic person? Isn't it really both sides? I thought that was a really good way of seeing it. And I think that's what you're saying, Scott, is that, we both neurotypical and autistic people can have trouble understanding each other, right?
Heck yeah. It works both. It's a two-way street. Empathy is a two-way street. It's the slogan to describe what you're just talking about. Excellent. Well, boy, this really got a lot of people in the room fired up. There's a lot of questions. Let me see. Do I want to ask you another question first before we jump into the Q&A? There's just like some controversies surrounding the extent to which their social skills are really a deficit among people with autism versus just an atypical social style. A lot of them, if you direct their eyes to another, they can stare at someone, they can do it. They're not motivated to do it. It's more maybe a motivational issue. I was wondering where you come down on these controversies in the field.
Yeah, well, I completely sympathize with the notion that most of the problem is the lack of the neurotypical world to accommodate and to take into account, the diverse ways that human beings can be. So, for example, let's take being able to successfully have a job interview. Right. So we could say, yes, this person is going to come in for the autistic person comes in for the interview, doesn't necessarily have, smooth conversational skills back and forth, isn't making eye contact. And as long as, we define a successful interview as having those skills, then they will always be seen as deficits. But if you start to expand your view of what an interview could be, so that you don't necessarily, you would say, well, for this job, do you have to have good eye contact, or should I be looking at, these other skills that I'm really interested in for this job, and I don't really care, right, if this person makes eye contact with me? Then suddenly the whole thing changes. Unfortunately, there's a big world out there that hasn't accommodated yet. And so, functionally, it becomes a deficit. because of the world we live in. There's so many aspects of society that are like that, unfortunately. And then I think, we also have to recognize that, because I work in a clinic and I talk to, a lot of autistic people who are coming to us for help, is that sometimes people are experiencing their own situation, as a challenge. So, I talked about social anxiety earlier on, and social anxiety is actually something that many autistic people experience. I don't know if it's inherent anxiety or it's just the anxiety that comes from trying to live in a neurotypical world. But regardless, when this person may really desire social interaction, but feel overwhelmed with anxiety at trying to even try it. So, that's a kind of, I don't know if I'd call it a deficit. It's a real life challenge that we actually have tools to help people with, right? There's lots of ways. I mean, we have good empirically validated treatments, right, for helping people who are feeling anxious and overcoming what may feel like a deficit or a challenge, so that person can feel more happy and successful in the world.
Do you think Larry David has autism?
Who?
Larry David from Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Oh, I don't really know that person.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll let other people in the chat box. So.
Yeah, maybe we should take another vote.
He often does things, and he's like, and people call him an asshole. He's like, "What? No good?" I feel like, yeah, that happens to me sometimes. Like, I'll say something, and I have no idea that was something you're not supposed to say to someone, and they'll be like, "You're an asshole." It's like, what? What did I do? What did I do? Yeah. Anyway, any Curb Your Enthusiasm fans in the room? Come on, don't be shy. I can't be the only one. Okay, Susan Topper. I'm just gonna go through some questions for you.
Okay.
Susan Topper. We were Susan Topper. Sean White. Fasting behind the scenes quote behind the scenes info about how these diagnoses happen. My son was diagnosed as 2E, gifted plus ADHD, a couple of years ago at age 6. At the time, the clinician had him return for follow-up testing to determine whether he also had some levels of ASD. The results were inconclusive. Can you speak to the potential benefits of having him retested as in quotes, now that he is a little older? How would such an additional diagnosis help him/us?
Yeah. So those are really, really good questions. And that confusion between ADHD and autism is really common. And we see kids in the clinic all the time where we're trying to sort that out. And sometimes a difficulty, such as those that do come along with autism, doesn't show up until a person gets into certain situations. So somebody could be doing quite well at home, for example, and really comfortable with people that they know well, partly because they've learned about that person, they're very predictable, and then get into another environment where they don't know the person, where you're having to process that information quickly and make sense of it in real time. And then suddenly you're like, whoa, I am having trouble really being able to negotiate this social situation. So, in general, in development, interactions become more and more complicated. You think about by the time you're a teenager and you have to learn to do something like flirt, right? I mean, those are very complicated sets of rules, right? How long do you look at someone before you look away? That it doesn't make it feel like you're being weird, right? Instead of flirting. And so these are things that, come up. And then what happens is that, a person may have, be autistic or have, some aspects of autism, and they may not really, it may not become an issue until they get into those more complicated situations. And that's why often you do see, diagnoses later in life, right? Because maybe early in life, the challenges just have not been as big that it has required, them to do things like real-time social processing or multitasking, social processing where you're in a conversation with many people. But so I think your question was, what is the value of getting a diagnosis? And I have talked to a lot of autistic people who've gotten a diagnosis later in life, sometimes as a teenager, sometimes as an adult. And invariably, they describe it as a huge relief. Because if you know you're having some trouble, right, with making sense, for example, out of social cues or making friendships, or maybe you want to engage in some of these more unusual behaviors and you think, oh, my peers don't seem to want to talk about, this topic all day long, right? And so and especially I think when kids get into being teenagers and somewhat earlier is where you're forming your identity. And you're reflecting on yourself and trying to make sense out of yourself. And also people are starting to become more judgmental about you, right? So maybe earlier on, it was tolerated that no big deal, everybody's a little different. And then
quirky
or whatever. And then you get into being a teenager and everybody's, very judgmental. And so suddenly you're feeling like, why am I having this trouble? And if you don't have a explanation, you usually say, because I'm a bad person, or there's something wrong with me that is my fault, right? If only I tried harder. And so a lot of people, when they get the diagnosis, it's like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden my world, makes sense to me. And then the other thing is that you can actually become friends and hang out with other people on the spectrum, right? And actually develop friendships with people that are more like you and talk about what it's like to have some of these both strengths and challenges. And even, have role models, right? There's so many amazing role models now that are autistic. And to see, okay, here's a person that did have my kind of struggles, but also my kind of strengths. And look what they did with their life. This is who I could be too. So there's a lot of reasons, I think, why, getting a diagnosis can be really helpful. That being said, I will say there still is, I think, an individual choice around disclosure. And people, whether it's an adolescent or an adult, they think through whom do I want to tell this to, whom do I not want to tell this to. At Duke University, we have a support group for Duke students on the spectrum, and I've been working on really enhancing our celebration of neurodiversity at Duke. And we're developing tools for the faculty to help make sure that our Duke students who are autistic are successful. And I've been having a little trouble getting those students to actually be presenters at some of our training, because they're not, even though they disclose to certain people, they're not ready to disclose to others. So, I think these folks tell me that they're still glad they have the diagnosis because it makes sense of their world. They may or may not be ready to, share this. And so we have to be really sensitive to all those issues as well.
Thank you. Thank you for being so sensitive. Anonymous attendee asks, how are early symptoms of autism different for 2E kids? Or are they different? Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that one of the things that makes it a little more complicated, I guess, is, well, two things. One is that often for a child who, and when we say 2E, I'm going to think of this as, if you were to maybe give an IQ to, I don't know how you're defining that giftedness. It might be giftedness in a special area, or it might be giftedness as you define it on an IQ test. But either way, those kids often actually don't have the difficulties with language development. In fact, the old term Asperger's syndrome was defined by having difficulties in social interaction and having, certain restricted range of interests, or, having preoccupations and interests, but not necessarily having any difficulties with language or cognitive ability. And so that might now be a person who, is autistic and gifted. But what happens is that early language delay is one of the most easily recognized symptoms for both pediatricians and for parents. And it helps with early diagnosis. And when that's missing, that people are less likely to have concerns. And then often what happens is that during the early parts of life, let's say from age 12 months to 4 or so, the demands of the home environment are not too significant. And so you don't really even see some of the social difficulties until that child starts going into preschool and into the classroom. And then trying to negotiate peers is when you start to say, wait a minute, why is my child, socially isolated? Why is my child not able to form these friendships like the other kids? And so that often is how it affects, sort of early detection, is that it comes later, usually when you get into some kind of school environment. Because I think one of the differences is that parents and even siblings to, like an older sibling, they're really, they have certain ways of being that the child can learn. They're very predictable, and they have predictable routines. And then you get into the classroom, and peers are, it's kind of the opposite of predictable, right? They're complicated, and peer relationships are complicated. So that's where things start to, then parents start to question what's going on with my child.
Makes a lot of sense. Anonymous attendee says, I work with a 5-year-old girl who is autistic. What are some ways and tools I could try to help her be more attentive in our sessions? Any idea would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, so what kind of, if you don't mind, what kind of sessions are you having? Are there therapy sessions? Are you a teacher? Would you mind describing a little bit more?
They can't, because they're an anonymous attendee.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so I'm just going to assume something like a teaching situation. So one of the most common things that comes up with teaching an autistic child, and especially if they're having trouble paying attention, is that they're having trouble following the instructions and processing the information that's being given to them, right? And so the first thing I look at is the actual teaching setting. And I look at things like how much extra materials and stimulation is in the room that might be distracting. And I try to create an environment that's very conducive to learning by having only the really important elements that I want the child to attend to available. I pay attention to the lighting and the sound in the room. That can be extremely distracting. And even the type of light, if you can make a difference. So sometimes, those overhead really bright lights can be difficult. And then I think about how I'm presenting the information that I want to convey. So even a child who has good language, if they are autistic, will have often trouble processing that language if it's done very quickly, and particularly if there's a lot of abstract concepts. So it's much better to kind of, slow things down a bit, but also be very concrete and explicit. So rather than, just assuming they might understand, kind of fill in the gaps of what your expectations are. And then finally, even gifted children who are autistic benefit from visual supports. So providing information that's in a written format or with pictures, really explaining, writing things out step by step with pictures so that you can follow along. And then finally, I am a big advocate for interspersing learning with physical activity, because I think many kids learn better if they've had a lot of exercise. And that also gets into the area of sleep. I would be really thinking about, is this child have any sleep problems? Because I know that if they're tired, they're not going to be able to pay attention as well. So these are all the kinds of things, you sort of think of yourself as like a, private investigator or something, where your goal is to understand all the things that could enhance learning. And it could be a myriad of things, but usually the environment, how I'm presenting the information, and then is this a child who's well rested and has had exercise? Those are the things that come to mind.
Thank you. There's two more questions. We only have about 5 more minutes left. Do you mind? Let me just quickly answer the next one. I want to answer the next one. So the next one is autism solely described as folks who misunderstand social cues and do not engage socially in an NT way? I'm having trouble understanding this combo because autistic people I know are deeply empathetic and socially engaged, but have other presentations that are in line with autism. Well, thank you so much for saying that, because no, we were just pulling out one diagnostic criteria, but it's a whole system. I mean, my gosh, psychopaths have social deficits, right? Like not all people with autism are psychopaths, and not all people who are psychopaths have autism. Simon Baron-Cohen wrote a really good book about the difference between the two, by the way. And empathy itself has different components. So people with autism tend to have quite intact ability to feel the emotions of others. They just have a difficulty with cognitive empathy, with being able to see and read the emotional expressions on someone's face and understand what they mean. But they still have intact, often affective empathy. And actually, psychopaths are the reverse. Psychopaths have very good cognitive empathy. They can use that to manipulate others, but they don't feel what other people feel. So I hope that help just makes it very clear, Mr. or Mrs. Or they anonymous attendee, that no, that there's many reasons why someone can have bad social skills. Okay, that's not autism is a system, so you look at a wide variety of things, and also there are a lot of aspects of empathy that are intact. Someone else asked, what is an appropriate age or maturity level to explain a diagnosis to your child? And what's the proper response for them to follow up with someone who might ask about it? Can you answer that in just a couple minutes?
Yeah, so
and was my answer good to the other person?
Yeah, no, that was
was that fair? Was that fair?
Yeah, no, I think that was fair. So, I think the idea of talking to your child about autism, it's like a lot of things that are sensitive topics with kids. It's not one conversation, and it is, it's a series of conversations that may, occur again and again throughout that individual's life. And it has to also be sort of framed from the perspective of where that child is developmentally. So, for example, let's say it's a 10-year-old. So one of the things that we know about kids as they develop is that early on, they don't really reflect on themselves, right, from the point of view of other people. Like a 3-year-old isn't thinking, am I popular, right, or something, but somewhere along the line, and actually this can be kind of delayed in autism because, as you were just pointing out, that cognitive perspective taking may be delayed. But at some point along the line, many kids do start to think, I'm different, right? So they're not labeling it, but they're starting to, and maybe somebody has made a comment. Right. And so one of the things I always think about is this is the point at which that child is developing a sense of themselves. And we really, really don't want it to be, there's something wrong with me. Right. And so I really like the conversation to be about how everyone is different, right, in some way. And we all have areas where we feel confident and we think, we're good at this. And we all have areas, everybody has areas where we're struggling or we're not as, this is not our strength, right? And that there's certain patterns of those strengths and weaknesses that we can actually happen with some frequency that are given a label, right? And I would talk about all different kinds of labels. So for example, if a child has trouble reading, right, we can call that dyslexia. Or if a child has this, it can be called that. And sometimes kids have trouble with understanding social interactions, that can be called autism, right? And so this, there's so many different ways of being in the world. And the good news is that every one of those people can be successful. But I think the main thing is that you are really following your child's lead, and trying to understand it from their point of view. So it's not like, okay, when you're 10, I'm going to tell my child this, but really, when do you have that sense that the child is starting to think, what's going on with me? I need to understand. But I think the main thing is to be celebratory, right? And to, as the child develops, to help develop an identity where it's okay to be different, right? And in fact, guess what? Some of the most influential and creative people in the world are the ones that are different. And that's what makes our world really an exciting world to live in. And so instilling that sense, I think, is just so important.
Absolutely important. Let's end on that note. It's a great note. Maybe some people can, there are some questions that were remaining. Maybe they can email someone at the 2E Center, and we can, I don't want to take any more of your time, but maybe I can try to answer to the best of my ability. And if you do have time, maybe you can answer it. So just some announcements here. First of all, I want to give a shout out to Liz Baker, who's in the audience today. She's a rising star in the field of autism research, and she's the one that had originally recommended your name. She had mentioned, I asked her once who her favorite autism researcher is, and she mentioned you, and it got on my radar, and I'm really glad that you're grateful to her for that. And also, I want to say, with a little bit of tears in my eyes, this is my last conversations on calling to diversity, but not just tears in my eyes, but also excitement that I get to pass the baton over to my esteemed and awesome colleague, Maria Kennedy. Maria will be the new host. Maria first joined the Bridges Academy staff as the director of the Phoenix program, and after successfully growing the program each year, she has taken on the position of director of the Bridges Educational Group. And I know she is going to, like she does with everything, knock out of the park her job as host. But it has truly been my privilege doing this series for 2 seasons with you all. And I truly hope it was helpful to all of you who have been joining us so regularly. So thank you for this opportunity.
Well, awesome, Scott. Thank you so much. So thank you, Dr. Kaufman, and thank you, Dr. Dawson. It has been our absolute pleasure. The chat has been blowing up.
It has.
So it's really been wonderful. And I know that there are lots and lots of questions, and so we will try and get back to people. So we will share those answers via our 2E News. So if you have not signed up, please log into 2enews.com and become a member. So it is free, by the way. There's no charge. It's free. So we will definitely share Dr. Dawson's answers there. And we will keep track of where Dr. Kaufman is. And remember to check out his psychology podcast, because it truly is awesome. So on that note, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. And
thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Look forward to seeing everybody again next month. So be safe.
Take care.